How's it everyone who's watching this? This is my 53rd video channel, and today we're going to be doing something a little different than usual. To celebrate the 96th anniversary of Alfred North Whitehead's gifted lectures, which would become his groundbreaking process in reality, I've decided to make a small series focused on him, Bergson and Deleuze, each of whom can be characterized as process philosophers. For today's episode, the focus is going to be on the first lecture from Whitehead's book, Modes of Thought, titled Importance. Without further ado, let's get into it. Whitehead begins by outlining what he hopes to examine through the whole course, the two other lectures of which we'll be looking at later on in this week. Essentially, Whitehead's focus falls squarely on the presuppositions often taken for granted when it comes to human experience. However, he warns that the goal isn't to develop any sort of framework for a systematic philosophy, which would be too ambitious for such a short course. Whitehead is instead interested in what comes before systematization, as he himself puts it.
Philosophy can exclude nothing. Thus, it should never start from systemization. Its primary stage can be termed assemblage. Such a process is, of course, unending.
In his eyes, systematic philosophy is the domain of specialists, whilst every educated person should concern themselves with assemblage. With this in mind, Whitehead turns towards the four people he sees as the greatest thinkers of the Western world, representing stages of assemblage: Plato, Aristotle, Leibniz, and William James. The first year is no surprise, especially given Whitehead's famous claim that all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato. For our author, he essentially discovered just how important a mathematical system was. However, Plato also had his failings. The misconceptions of the times polluted his thinking. Moving on to Aristotle, we find here a coupling of systemization and assemblage, partially inherited from Plato. Next, Leibniz, who had 2,000 years of thought backing him, is seen by Whitehead to be a fantastic polymath. Not only was he a philosopher, he was also a mathematician, theologian, and scientist. In this way, he marks something of a break with strict systemization. However, it's only with William James that assemblage truly came into his own. As Whitehead says,
His intellectual life was one protest against the dismissal of experience in the interest of system. He had discovered intuitively the great truth with which modern logic is now wrestling.
Whitehead is essentially critiquing the approach of systemization for its refusal to deal with general things. Although yes, systems are important, philosophy can't just ignore the bigger picture. In quite eloquent words, he describes how what differentiates civilized beings or humans from animals, like the nightingale, is our ability to think about generality. Central to this concept is an opposition between what Whitehead calls importance and the matter of fact. The two, as paradoxical as it may sound, are simultaneously antithetical to each other and mutually dependent. This is clear in the case of concentration, where we focus on something by giving it importance, which in turn leads us to attend to the matter of fact. This maps quite nicely onto generality. In Whitehead's eyes, it's always accompanied by a particularity of sorts. He illustrates this with the words this and that, mapped onto qualities like important, difficult, and lovely. Whitehead says that what he calls our primary consciousness rests on this latter set of general and quite frankly vague notions, which we specify through the former set. In his eyes, generality is always lurking in the background, perceived as the despair of so-called cultivated people due to its seemingly matter-of-fact and obvious nature, but persistent nonetheless. Philosophy in fact requires generality. However, this causes some tension, is looked down upon as imprecise, disappointing, and even, as Whitehead himself puts it, degenerate. The question is how the particular can offer us a view into importance. Concerning someone falling into general phrasing, our author says that
Such a lapse is uneducated because it expresses the obvious, and yet it is philosophic because the obvious embodies the permanent importance of variable detail.
In words that recall Henri Bergson, who we'll examine tomorrow, Whitehead goes on to describe the problems linked to the fact that learning tends towards detail. What this implies is a natural tendency in the direction of systemization that comes at the cost of assemblage. In his opinion, it's necessary to essentially shake free from learning if we want to grasp it properly. To paraphrase almost directly from the text, we must first be able to grasp a given topic in the rough before we smooth and shape it. When it comes to some of the fundamental general ideas that are made through the filter and into Western learning, these come from three main sources in Whitehead's view: the Greeks, those he rather nebulously describes as Semites, and Egyptians. The first were responsible for things logical and aesthetic, the second for morality and religion, and the third for practical knowledge. However, by becoming crystallized, these three forms actually restrict our understanding of importance in such a way that any exploration of a concept must necessarily separate itself from the ancients. To this end, Whitehead tries to break matter-of-factness and importance down into some basic elements. Essentially, to begin with, the first is nothing more than the notion of mere existence. However, there's a problem here. Namely, once we start talking about existence, all sorts of things begin appearing in the woodwork. There's actual existence, then there's fanciful existence, stuff like that. In this way, any matter-of-fact thing implies a multiplicity of other existences that make up its environment, both connected and beyond it. Likewise, as he says,
the notion of importance also refers to grades of importance and types of importance. Here again, we reach the notion of more and less. Also, something has to be important.
As a result of this idea of the more and the less, importance itself falls back on the matter of fact. However, in order to deal with this multiplicity, there has to be a kind of intellectual freedom that can select certain elements. This selection, in turn, is dependent on the idea of this or that, afforded by importance itself. Having now gone full circle, he turns his attention towards a kind of determinism implied by the matter of fact. We can see this in nature and the rotation of the earth. We exist essentially at the whim of the general, living our lives according to day and night as necessity. However, importance, and the selection applies, allows us to combine this with a sort of freedom. Here, he seeks to place the two notions in a new light, giving us a more complete definition than before. The matter of fact, in his words, is the emergence into thought of the habit of that mere existence from earlier, which lines up with external elements and the pressures they exert. This is our understanding of nature and of things bigger than ourselves, which we are always immersed in and which acts as one extreme of thought. The other extreme is importance, which Whitehead is careful to separate from interest due to the latter's focus on the individual, adding the caveat that it does ultimately fall under one of importance's many aspects. As a mode of thought, it is sometimes at odds with the matter of fact, since whilst the second is necessarily objective, the first implies a kind of subjective dimension that limits its scope. However, there's also something of a catch-22, as Whitehead says,
the most ardent upholders of objectivity in scientific thought insist upon its abhorrence. Apart from a feeling of interest, you would merely notice the doctrine and not uphold it.
Here, we arrive at the next section of the lecture, Whitehead aiming to underline just how difficult it is to think about mere fact. In his eyes is a triumph of what he calls the abstractive intellect, rather than being something ingrained. Children and animals, for instance, never pay attention to the matter of fact as it exists by itself. Instead, they are always subsumed in a world of importance, where their attention rests on their interests. The reason why Whitehead specifies that mere facts, that is to say single ones, are specifically due to an abstractive mode of thought, lies in their nature. They are, by necessity, mythical. At first this might sound a bit bizarre. How can a fact be mythical? Essentially, as the author explains, everything is connected. No fact exists by itself. You can only construct such an idea through a process of abstraction, which specifically suppresses the presupposed context or environment that gives rise to its existence. This is what is represented in this diagram, where we can see that the fact that X is a ewe presupposes that X is also sheep, female, an animal, grass-eating, and so on ad infinitum. All mere facts, Whitehead argues, are based in specific viewpoints produced by that suppression. As a result, they also require importance, since any perspective requires a gradient of relevance that dictates that one thing can be filtered out and another kept. Feeling is what underlies this, defined as the agent behind reducing the universe down into something singular. To borrow Whitehead's words,
perspective is the outcome of feeling, and feeling is graded by the sense of interest as to the variety of its differentiations.
To go back to the example of saying X is a ewe, this statement implies that, in the moment it's uttered, we have some kind of interest in specifying that fact in particular, rather than say its status as a herbivore. At the end of the day, this myth does have some importance, since without it we would have to deal with infinites that are incapable of definition. However, it's necessary to be aware of the inherent limitation such facts hold. He offers logic as an example. It works only insofar as the unstated presuppositions suppressed by the perspective used don't lead to difficulties. Here, he's speaking from personal experience. Remember that Whitehead, along with Bertrand Russell, wrote the Principia Mathematica, a project destroyed by Russell's discovery of his titular paradox. Nevertheless, he tells us to be careful about calling theories and disciplines that work on the basis of mythical facts wrong or false. Instead, Whitehead is careful to qualify them as unguarded, meaning that they contain intrinsic limitations that we can discover and work around. At this point, he summarizes this all to give another aspect of a concept that adorns the title of this lecture.
One characterization of importance is that it is that aspect of feeling whereby a perspective is imposed upon the universe of things felt.
At this point, Whitehead asks if all this talk about perspectives just reduces importance down into nothing more than the matter of fact, coupled with an absence of intrinsic interest. So far, we've only really considered it from a negative point of view after all, putting it in terms of suppression. His answer is that, whilst it is impossible to truly reduce something in such a way, perspective gets pretty close. He calls it dead abstraction, removed from a world of so-called living importance. This latter concept is first and foremost something general, albeit covered up and obscured. The four main culprits for this are identified by Whitehead to be morality, logic, religion, and art, each claiming to exhaust importance. Nevertheless, this is nothing more than an illusion, since there are perspectives of the universe which ignore these things entirely, or rather, to be a bit more precise, hold them as completely irrelevant. In order to demonstrate this point, he gives an example of one of his friend's 10th birthdays. To celebrate, her great aunt had to bring two people to watch the opera Carmen, one of whom was Whitehead. Afterwards, she asked him whether or not the people in the play were nice people, something that he and the great aunt sidestepped. The point is that, as he says,
Of course smugglers are naughty people, and Carmen is carefree as to niceties of behavior, but while they are singing their parts and dancing on stage, morals vanish and beauty remains.
In other words, the importance of morality became negligible or irrelevant. It's in this way that any theory which holds one or the other of the four culprits as some kind of ultimate aim is inherently flawed. You can't spend your life constantly defending your morals, controlling your thoughts so as to be logical, or in an endless search for beauty. It's simply impossible to exhaust importance in any single direction. Returning to the question of morality, the gist of it is that certain codes are relevant to certain universes. If certain presuppositions aren't there, those codes become pointless. The idea that they remain stable or constant across time and situations is nothing more than an illusion, one that has done a lot of harm to philosophy through the ages. For example, imagine applying the same moral codes to fish as to family relations in Whitehead's late 1930s America, with some of the former laying hundreds to thousands of eggs per year. It's just incomprehensible. The universe isn't the same. However, Whitehead doesn't want to negate the meaning of morality in any way. The rest of his section is basically focused on how he conceives of his codes. For him, it consists of maximizing importance by trying to control the processes that make up our world. The aim of morality is to unite the harmony, intensity, and vividness of experience itself, with codes being a way to draw us out of our own insights, producing general judgments that are more or less appropriate for the epochs they govern. In Whitehead's eyes, these are incredibly essential for the development of civilization, but it's a mistake to try and overstate their importance. Being a Christian, his obvious point of reference is the Ten Commandments, which, although generally valid, must be tempered with common sense. For example, he takes the idea that working or being allowed on Sunday is an absolute factor in all of existence to be, well, ridiculous. At the end of the day, Whitehead argues that
there is no one behavior system belonging to the essential character of the universe as the universal moral idea. What is universal is the spirit which should permeate the circumstances of its adoption.
Basically, his point is that morality is not something that indicates what you ought to do, but rather it's what should act as the general idea that can justify a certain action. Killing something, for instance, can be moral or immoral. It's not black and white. When it comes down to it, in its ethics, an act is good only to the degree that it safeguards the importance of experience. It's on this note that he takes a step back in order to talk about the usefulness of limited or finite thinking. In his eyes, many innovations in philosophy have come from mistakes, particularly those having to do with oversimplification. His example of this is Aristotle and his classification of things into genera, species, and subspecies, something that replaced Plato's quite fuzzy notion of division. On the one hand, Whitehead says that Plato was right, and Aristotle was wrong. There is no simple point where one genus ends and another begins, the same holding true for species. However, our author nuances this by saying that, as a practical question, it was Aristotle who was right and Plato who was muddled. Because we necessarily think from a perspective of, well, perspectives, the former system has more usefulness when it comes to thinking than the latter's. It may suppress a universe of facts in its application, but it also acts as a valuable analytic tool that has generally led to valuable innovations. As he puts it,
The Greeks, with their airy generalizations, were always children, very fortunate for the modern world. Panic of error is the death of progress, and the love of truth is its safeguard.
Keeping with this idea of intellectual development, Whitehead now turns to discussing how history and its records have been treated the last few hundred years. Despite the seeds being sown earlier, he argues that modern thought in particular has become more concentrated in study of history, going through a series of phases. The first of these dealt with emphasizing authenticity, where questions like "did Plato write this?" predominated. This, a phase of corrections, was followed by one of details. With this, the focus fell primarily on whether or not manuscripts and records were correct or unchanged. As Whitehead remarks, this was necessarily limited by the vagueness intrinsic to dealing with works passed down over time, particularly when it's a question of authors who didn't write things down. Finally, modern history, beginning from the mid-18th century, has entered another phase, one where the question is one of describing types of activity, mood, and beliefs. It's this that I've termed the phase of transitions in the diagram shown here. Whitehead demonstrates the distinction between this stage of history and the one that preceded it with the examples of Richard Bentley, who died in 1742, and Edward Gibbon, born in 1737. The former was what he calls a typical scholarly critic, whilst the latter's main focus was charting the decline and fall of political systems and the way they implicate changes in activity. To borrow his words,
Gibbon corrected no additions of authors, and Bentley depicted no transitions in behavior.
Even more recently than this, Whitehead argues, the influence of the physical sciences has begun to limit the scope of history in order to focus it on narrating nothing more than sequences of events, an ideal of knowledge that he describes as the triumph of a matter of fact. For Whitehead, this is necessarily confined to abstract mythology in the way that it tries to suppress any notion of motives or importance, something that, as we saw earlier, is necessarily a failure. As he gives as an example, it's just impossible to write a history of religion without taking into account the role of belief. As he says,
Thus, the series of history as a mere sequence wears itself out. It is a make-believe. There are oceans of facts, ideas lie beyond matter of fact, and yet provide the color of its development.
In his view, the matter of fact is, by necessity, an abstraction that requires us to limit thought to purely formal relations. It's a mistake to hold it as the be-all and end-all of reality, since, as a consequence of this abstractive process, the concrete world slips through its net. Science has its limits, and there's nothing wrong about that. It's just important to acknowledge them. Using quite an absurd example, Whitehead asks us if we can believe that using science to measure the dictators, prime ministers, and newspaper editors of Europe can somehow give us a picture of a continent's turmoil. Obviously, the answer is a firm no. Again, however, Whitehead is not anti-science. Like we discussed earlier, he's literally the man who wrote the Principia Mathematica. His point is instead that it's always incomplete. Every social system realizes different modes of interest or importance, some working in the background, others in the foreground. There's always a complex web of interlocking processes that can't be reduced down to any one mere fact, without suppressing a whole universe of other elements. To conclude, Whitehead tells us that
the concentration of attention upon matter of fact is the supremacy of the desert. Any approach to such tramp bestows on learning a fugitive and cloistered virtue.
Now, with this, we're done with Alfred North Whitehead's lecture, Importance, understanding some of the many characteristics associated with the notion of importance as relates to the matter of fact. I truly hope you enjoyed or learned something. If you feel I got anything wrong or wasn't as clear as I could have been, please do feel free to let me know in the comments, so I can do better. Next time, we'll be looking at a work by the French process philosopher Henri Bergson, titled An Introduction to Metaphysics. Until then, bye!